All right, buckle up, everybody, because we've got a mountain of news to get through, a whole week of White House action. And let me tell you, based on what you folks have sent in, things are getting interesting.
Interesting might be an understatement.
Well, understatement or not, our listeners want to cut through the noise.
Right.
They want the implications, any precedents set or broken, maybe even a little, is this legal analysis thrown in for good measure.
And that's exactly what we're here to do. We'll break it all down, focus on the facts, and try to help you understand the potential consequences of all this activity.
What strikes me is just how wild some of these stories are. I mean, we're talking potential constitutional clashes, Elon Musk shaking things up, international fallout. We've even got a papal rebuke thrown in there.
It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure.
Okay, so first up, we got to talk about this Gulf of America business. The Associated Press got themselves barred from the Oval Office and Air Force One because they refused to use President Trump's new name for the Gulf of Mexico.
It does sound a little like something you'd hear on a satirical news show.
Right, but it's a real executive order issued January 20th.
It is. And the AP, well, they're sticking to journalistic standards. They're calling it the Gulf of Mexico. And the White House is retaliating by, well, essentially limiting their access.
Seems a bit heavy-handed for a name change, don't you think?
It does raise some questions about freedom of the press, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the First Amendment protects the press from government censorship, right? This feels like, I don't know, an attempt to punish a news organization for not playing along.
It's definitely a concerning precedent, and this isn't the only story this week where concerns about potential overreach have been raised.
You're talking about Elon Musk and this whole DOGE initiative.
The Department of Government Efficiency.
Right, DOGE. Shrinking the federal workforce, and from what I'm reading, things are getting a bit chaotic over there.
A bit chaotic is one way to put it. We've seen mass firings at agencies like the National Nuclear Security Administration, the NNSA, the agency that oversees our nuclear weapons stockpile.
Not exactly a place you'd want chaos, right?
Well, according to NPR, managers were given just a few hours to fire hundreds of employees, and it's creating a lot of confusion, not to mention the potential impact on, well, national security.
I mean, firing people with top-secret security clearances on such short notice, that just seems like a recipe for disaster waiting to happen.
It's definitely raising some eyebrows. And then there's the issue of DOGE's access to sensitive data.
Right. That was the other big thing that jumped out at me. What's the deal with that?
Well, there are concerns about DOGE having access to highly sensitive information, particularly within the Treasury Department.
Like what kind of information?
The Treasury Department's Inspector General actually launched an audit to investigate DOGE's access to the federal payment system. That's the system that handles trillions of dollars in transactions and contains a vast amount of personal data.
The federal payment system?
Yeah.
Well, that's a major privacy concern.
Exactly. 14 states have actually filed a lawsuit trying to limit DOGE's access, arguing that it violates privacy laws, like the Privacy Act of 1974. They're even bringing up potential violations of the Internal Revenue Code.
So they're worried about DOGE misusing this data.
That's the gist of it.
Okay, so we've got potential First Amendment violations with this AP situation, and now potential privacy violations with DOGE.
Yeah.
Is there any part of the government that's not causing a stir this week?
Well, let's not forget about the international stage.
You're talking about PEPFAR.
The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief.
Right. A program that's been pretty universally praised, right? Saved millions of lives around the world.
PEPFAR has been a major success story, a true bipartisan effort that has made a real difference in the fight against HIV/AIDS. But there are concerns that recent actions by the administration could jeopardize that progress.
You're referring to that announcement about a 90-day pause on all foreign aid. I know that caused quite a bit of panic.
It did.
And although they later issued a waiver to allow HIV treatment to continue, the initial announcement, well, it sent shockwaves through the global health community.
And even with the waiver, there are still concerns about the implementation and the long-term impact, especially on prevention programs. Those weren't included in the waiver.
We actually have a PBS NewsHour interview with Anjali Atrakar from UNAIDS, and she paints a really bleak picture. If PEPFAR funding were to stop completely, she suggests we could see a tenfold increase in AIDS deaths. Millions of lives lost. Millions more infected.
It's a sobering reminder of the stakes involved in these decisions, and it raises questions about, well, About America's role in global health, its commitment to international aid.
Right. I mean, cutting programs that are literally saving
Is
lives.
that really putting America first?
It's a question a lot of people are asking, and it seems to tie into a larger pattern we're seeing in these articles.
What's that?
This blurring of lines between branches of government, almost like a constitutional crisis brewing.
Yes, that. Tell me more about what you're seeing.
So this blurring of lines, give us the rundown on that.
It seems like almost every day now there's a new court ruling blocking some part of the administration's agenda. Judges have blocked that executive order to end birthright citizenship. They halted DOGE's access to those Treasury records. And there was even a ruling that temporarily blocked that mass resignation plan for federal workers.
Okay, and how's the administration responding to all these legal challenges?
Well, Vice President Vance has publicly questioned whether the administration actually needs to comply with all court orders, and some advisors have even gone so far as to call for judges to be impeached.
Whoa, impeach judges.
It's definitely raising some serious concerns about, well, the administration's respect for the rule of law.
And the separation of powers.
Exactly.
It sounds like we're on a slippery slope here. I mean, the executive branch just refusing to follow court orders. That's pretty much a textbook definition of a constitutional crisis, wouldn't you say?
It's a dangerous path to be on, that's for sure. Our system of checks and balances is designed to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful.
And right now, that system is being tested. Big time.
It is. And meanwhile, President Trump is posting things on social media like, if it saves the country, it's not illegal.
Yeah, that one really got people talking. Where do we even begin to unpack that statement?
It's a statement that demands careful scrutiny, that's for sure.
I mean, it raises questions about the administration's view of the law, their willingness to operate outside of, established norms.
Absolutely. And it's a sentiment that kind of echoes throughout many of the actions we're seeing this week.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got press freedom potentially under attack, potential government overreach, a brewing global health crisis, and a possible constitutional showdown on the horizon. It's almost too much to process.
And we're not even done yet. We still need to talk about the economy.
You mean President Trump's big plan for reciprocal tariffs?
Ah, yes, the tariffs. Buckle up, everyone, because this is where things could get really interesting.
Reciprocal tariffs, just to remind everyone.
Yes.
That's basically matching tariffs, right?
Right. So the U.S. would impose the same tariff rate on imports from a country as that country levies on imports from the U.S. The idea is to create a level playing field and, encourage other countries to lower their trade barriers.
Okay, that sounds, reasonable on paper, but isn't there a risk of this escalating into a full-blown trade war? What happens if other countries just retaliate with their own tariffs?
That's the big fear, and there's a lot of debate among economists about the potential impact of these tariffs. We have an AP article here that quotes a number of experts, and they're divided. Some believe these tariffs could be a good thing, boost American manufacturing, force other countries to play fair.
Right, that's the administration's argument.
It is, but others are really worried about the potential consequences. Higher prices for consumers, slowed economic growth, even job losses in certain sectors.
Particularly in industries that rely heavily on imports.
Exactly. And let's not forget, all of this is happening against the backdrop of this newly proposed House GOP budget resolution, the one that includes a massive $4.5 trillion allocated for tax cuts.
Yeah, that got a lot of attention. Makes you wonder how they plan on funding those tax cuts.
Well, some analysts are saying that these new tariffs might be part of the equation. They're essentially talking about raising taxes on imports to pay for tax cuts that primarily benefit, wealthier Americans.
Definitely a controversial approach.
It is.
And speaking of controversial policies, there's this story about a new bill that would require voters to provide documentary proof of citizenship when they register to vote.
Ah, yes, the SAVE Act, Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act.
The SAVE Act. Okay, and what's the thinking behind this one?
Well, championed by Representative Chip Roy, a Republican, it recently passed the House, and now it's headed for the Senate.
Right, but isn't it already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections?
It is. So proponents of this bill are arguing that it's necessary to add an extra layer of protection to ensure the integrity of our elections.
But doesn't that create a barrier for legitimate voters who maybe don't have easy access to all these documents?
That's the main argument against the bill. Voting rights groups are really worried that it'll disenfranchise voters, especially minority groups, low-income communities, elderly voters who might not have, easy access to things like birth certificates, passports.
Things that a lot of us take for granted.
Right. And they point to Kansas, where a similar law was actually struck down in court because it was considered discriminatory.
So this debate, it really touches on fundamental rights, doesn't it? The accessibility of our democracy.
It does.
And it seems to be a recurring theme this week. Actions taken in the name of security or efficiency that could have unintended consequences for individual rights and freedoms.
You're hitting on a crucial point there. The potential for unintended consequences is something we have to be really mindful of when evaluating any policy, especially those that involve, restricting access or limiting rights.
It's all about striking that balance. Okay, so before we move on, there are a couple other things in this stack I just want to touch on. We've got a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's a landmark piece of legislation, right? It protects people with disabilities from discrimination.
It is. Section 504 has been instrumental in ensuring equal access for people with disabilities in education, employment, healthcare. I mean, virtually every aspect of public life. It's considered, a cornerstone of civil rights law.
But now a group of 17 states is saying it's unconstitutional.
17 states have joined this lawsuit, arguing that the federal government overstepped its authority when implementing those, this updated Section 504 rules. They're not even challenging specific provisions. They're going after the entire law.
And if they succeed?
It could weaken protections for millions of Americans with disabilities. It would be a major step backward.
It's hard to see how that would save the country, to quote President Trump.
It certainly raises questions.
All right, so what else is in this stack of news?
Well, we have Pope Francis weighing in on all this. He offered a pretty pointed critique of Vice President Vance's recent statements.
Vance, he's the one who suggested that people should prioritize their families and communities over others.
Okay.
Which kind of rubs some folks the wrong way.
It does, and some see it as a rejection of, Christian values, the whole charity begins at home argument.
Which maybe doesn't sit quite right in this context. So how did the Pope respond to all this?
Well, he issued a powerful call for universal love and fraternity, emphasized that Christian love extends to everyone without exception. And he specifically highlighted the need to care for migrants and refugees, which seemed like a pretty clear message to the administration and those restrictive immigration policies.
You don't often see a pope publicly challenging a sitting vice president, that's for sure.
It's a reminder that this administration's actions are being, they're being scrutinized on a global stage. Their policies are generating debate and, dissent far beyond Washington.
Okay, I think we've pretty much tackled everything in this avalanche of news. We've gone from freedom of the press to, worries about a global trade war. We even had some papal commentary. It's enough to make anyone's head spin.
It's a lot to take in, but I think it's important to remember that these are really complex issues with real-world consequences. We've tried to stick to the facts, avoid the hype. But this administration is clearly taking a bold and often controversial approach to governing.
And while they say these actions are necessary to save the country, to borrow that phrase from President Trump's social media post,
a lot of people are worried about the potential long-term impact on, our democracy, our institutions, our standing in the world.
Right. And that's what makes all this so important to understand.
This week's news really does underscore a crucial point, doesn't it?
The importance of an informed and engaged citizenry.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and passively consume the news. We have to be active participants in our democracy.
That means understanding the issues at stake and holding our leaders accountable. And that's not always easy, especially these days.
It's not, but it's more important now than ever.
Well said. From freedom of the press to tariffs to a potential global trade war, and even a little papal commentary for good measure, it's been a lot to process.
It really has, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you called it a whirlwind. I mean, this administration has been doing things that are really generating a lot of discussion and a fair bit of controversy, wouldn't you say?
To put it mildly. But even with all this chaos, with all these headlines, I keep coming back to one theme. Like, it's running through almost every story we've talked about.
And what would that be? What's the common thread?
It's this tension, right, between executive power and democratic norms. We see it in the way they're trying to, control the narrative, reshape the federal workforce, dictate terms on the global stage, and maybe even bypass those legal constraints when it suits them.
Yeah, I see what you mean. this week really has raised some fundamental questions about the limits of executive power, checks and balances in a functioning democracy, all that.
Exactly. And while the administration keeps saying these actions are all about, saving the country, remember, they're President Trump's social media posts.
Yes.
At what cost?
Right. It's a valid question. I mean, is it ever okay to erode democratic norms or to undermine the rule of law, even if you're doing it in the name of national security or efficiency? That's a question everyone needs to be asking themselves.
And that brings us right back to what you were talking about earlier, the importance of, informed citizens, engaged citizens. We can't just passively take in the news. We have to actively engage with these issues.
Absolutely. You have to think critically about the information you're getting. And then you got to hold those leaders accountable.
So before we sign off, I want to leave everyone with a challenge. Think of it as a call to action.
All right, I'm ready. Lay it on me.
Take what you've learned from this deep dive, and don't just let it sit there. Talk to people about it. Talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues. Post about it. Write to your elected officials. Get involved with organizations that are fighting for what you believe in.
Those are all great ideas. I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, right? Like things are changing so fast and the stakes feel so high. But we're not powerless.
Right. We have a voice.
We do. We have the power to shape the future, to create the world we want to live in. But it starts with each of us. It starts with being informed, being engaged, being active.
Beautifully said. Well, folks, I think that about wraps up this week's deep dive. I know it was a lot, a real roller coaster, but hopefully you're leaving with, a little better understanding of how things work, how complicated things are, and maybe, just maybe, a renewed sense of purpose.
Yeah.
To get out there and engage with the world.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining us. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.
Because your voice matters. Use it.